Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another online talk from Atheist Freethinkers. Today's topic is Wokism as a Parareligion. This is the English version of a talk I gave a couple of months ago in French. I will now share my PowerPoint presentation. Wokism as a Parareligion. First of all, I'm going to begin by defining what I mean by wokism, and then I'm going to look at several other authors. As discussed in my book, Stillbirth, the so-called woke movement is a political movement that claims to be on the political left, but has abandoned and betrayed the very Enlightenment values, especially universalism, which define what the left is. It promotes various anti-Enlightenment ideologies, neo-racism, anti-universalism, intersectionality, postmodernism, cultural relativism, etc. So I call it the post-left, or the anti-Enlightenment pseudo-left. And I consider it to be a para-religion. What I mean by that is an ideology which is not a religion in the strict sense, because there's no explicit supernatural belief system, but it behaves very much like a religion with dogmatism, manichaeism, moralism, irrational and non-falsifiable beliefs, ultra-sectarian practices such as anathematizing apostates and heretics, otherwise known as cancel culture. Now, that was my definition. I'm going to look at views of wokism by several other authors. This is a major book which many of you will probably be familiar with, by Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay, Cynical Theories. They define wokism as an illiberal and ideological movement claiming to be the exclusive promoter of social justice. They find its origins in postmodernism, gender theory, and anti-racism. And so-called social justice warriors, as they used to call themselves, and perhaps still do to some extent, claim exclusive expertise in fighting injustice and fighting for social justice. No one else. They have the monopoly on it. And they use uppercase for social justice to indicate that they're talking about the woke domain, not the generic meaning of whatever social justice means. And they sometimes qualify it as a religion, but not consistently. Now, here's another view of wokeism. This is a Québécois book of with two editors, Rachid Antonius and Norman Baillargeon. It's a collective work with a score of authors. I have a chapter in there, for example. There are various critical views of this left, as it calls itself. One very important word that I that I learned from reading other authors in this collection is the word isagoria, which means equality of all in freedom of speech, or to put it more explicitly, it means that the quality of an opinion does not depend on the identity of the person speaking, because this is something that the woke reject. For the woke, the right to speak depends on the individual's identity, and this makes any consensus impossible. This is Patrick Moreau in his text, La Guerre des Mots, War of Words. Rachid Antonius, who's one of the editors, observes that candidates for positions in universities and companies must now prove their agreement with the official morality, that is diversity, inclusivity, etc., just as in the past they had to prove their Catholicism. So we have a very religious aspect here. Similarly, Claude Simard, author of another chapter, says that the self-righteous the self-righteous being the woke, do not hesitate to flaunt their beliefs in order to impose them on others. Imagining themselves to embody social justice, they claim the purity of their views while scorning and ostracizing people who do not submit to the dogmas of their ideological sect. Their ostentatious virtue comes from a form of postmodern Phariseeism. They are, in fact, like the devout who display their faith publicly so as to appear morally superior. This is often referred to as virtue signaling. Another point of view, this one from the United States by John McWhorter, who is Black himself and deals specifically with the anti-racist pretensions of the woke. He is of the opinion that wokeism is literally a religion. He refers to the woke as the elect. That is, they think of themselves as the elect. McWhorter says that it is impossible to debate with the elect and useless to try. He considers the elect to be a scourge which must be treated as such. And once again, the word Pharisee is used to describe it, just as Claude Simard described them on the previous slide. The elect are our Pharisees, fostering anti-racist ideas that actually harm Black people. Another point of view, this is a French author, Jean-François Braunstein, and as you can see from the title, he considers wokeism to be a religion, literally. And he writes, our astonishment recalls the dismay that the last pagan philosophers felt in the face of the rise of the Christian religion. So he compares the current era to the era at the end of antiquity, when Christianity took over the Roman Empire. And here we see wokeism taking over many of our institutions. And it's a similar kind of unexpected and astonishing takeover. He considers wokeism to be totalitarian. The total lack of humor is undoubtedly the most distinctive character of woke thinking, and also the most chilling. This is where we best perceive their totalitarian character. The core of wokeism, in Braunstein's opinion, is gender theory, which opens the way to all attacks against science, against truth, and against reality itself. So he would disagree with McWhorter, who considers the anti-racism or the ostensible anti-racism to be the most important aspect of the woke mentality. Braunstein considers critical race theory to be second in importance, and he points out that it's not falsifiable. Another work, this one, another Quebecois book by David Santa Rosa, Critical Analysis of an Ideology. The author analyzes 3 documents which he considers representative of the woke thought in Quebec. A book by Judith Lucier, a film by Sauvé-Enville, Briser le Code, and another book by Ellis Béchard and Canapé Fontaine, which is in the form of an exchange of letters between the 2 authors. He observes that, well, once again, we meet non-falsifiability. For example, Judith Lucier, he quotes Lucier saying that if you question the idea of systemic racism, this proves that systemic racism exists. This is a circular statement which is not falsifiable. The woke make baseless, dishonest accusations that racism is the norm. They call it the code in Quebec. Well, that's just false. In Quebec, the norm is opposition to racism. Racism does exist, of course, like it exists in all societies, but it is socially unacceptable, and the norm is to reject racism. Sandra Rosa observes that for a very long time, Quebec culture was denigrated because it was not dominant. Today, while we claim to value minority cultures, it is now suddenly transformed into a dominant culture and thus must be condemned. So, in other words, the woke who claim to defend minorities do not even recognize French-speaking Quebecers as a minority within Canada, and just condemns them as more white people. He points out that wokeism is part of dominant mainstream thought. There is not the slightest doubt in his mind of that. In other words, wokeism is not does not contest. It's very conformist. It's mainstream thought. It's an ideology which tolerates no contradiction. For the woke, there are no legitimate adversaries with whom to argue. There are only enemies that can only be fought. Wokeism is like a religion. Its awakening is like the conversion of Paul of Tarsus on the road to Damascus, like a revelation, an awakening, hence the word woke. And he points out that the woke sense of the term decolonization is very different from the generic meaning. For most of us, decolonizing would mean a colony gaining its independence, a colony of the British Empire or the French Empire or some other empire, which then becomes an independent country and is no longer a colony. But no, the woke sense of decolonization is to deconstruct the foundations of Western civilization. In other words, it's to criticize and reject the values of the Enlightenment. Another point of view, this from another French author, Nathalie Heineck, is Wokism a totalitarianism? And the subtitle is Woke Hell is Paved with Good Intentions. And the answer to the question in the title is yes, it is a totalitarianism in her opinion, in the opinion of the author. She considers wokeism to be the Stalinism or Maoism of the 21st century, but with censorship imposed socially, not by the state. So this is cancel culture, social censorship by peers or by institutions, loss of job, loss of contracts, etc. She considers it to be an Anglo-American import. She sees wokeism as highly religious, puritanical, with Orwellian aspects. And she points out that there's a real inconsistency between the woke attitude towards sex and its attitude towards race. Sex is considered fluid. You can even change your sex just by declaring that you're a person of the other sex. But race is fixed, and they are very categorical about that. The woke tend to be anti-secular. Nathalie Heineck refers to the anti-secularism of wokeized Islamo-leftists. And the expression Islamo-leftism, I will explain a bit more in a later slide. The woke support communitarianism and multiculturalism. And I remind you that multiculturalism is just a pretty euphemism, which means multi-tribalism. It means associating people more with their tribe rather than consider them as human beings or citizens on a par with everybody else. In other words, attaching too much importance to personal identities. And the woke oppose Republican universalism, which is a key value of Enlightenment. And a little quote here from Heineck. France finds itself in the vanguard of a fight which today concerns the entire Western world. And I would agree completely with that. It's because France is in the vanguard of secularism, and the woke tend to be very anti-secular. I'll discuss that a little further in later slides. You have perhaps heard of the so-called grievance studies hoax by Bogosian, Pluckrose, and Lindsay. Pluckrose and Lindsay being the two authors I discussed at the beginning. Bogosian, a colleague of theirs. These three university professors perpetrated this hoax by submitting under fake names parodies of scientific articles to sociology journals with absurd subjects such as rape culture among dogs, the sexism of astronomy, a proposal that white students attend lectures while lying chained on the floor. And several of these articles were accepted for publication before they were found out, and the hoax was discovered. And here is a really interesting, pretty damning quotation from Peter Boghossian. He says, "Wokism is a universal solvent which destroys everything it touches." Patrick Moreau, he was one of the authors in the Québécois collective work that I talked about earlier. This is from an article he had published in Le Devoir a few months ago, about wokeism. He considers it he says it's a new ideology born in the United States, which does not in any way correspond to the principles of what is traditionally called the left. I agree completely. That's why I call it the post-left. It has revolutionary pretensions, but its revolution is largely moral and symbolic. It is more akin to a religious movement like Protestant revivals of the 18th and 19th centuries than to a truly political movement. And here is an opinion from the Alliance of Former Muslims in Ireland, from an article on their website, The Cancer of Wokism. Wokism can accurately be described as a mutation of Marxism, with the proletariat and bourgeoisie substituted for particular ethnic and sexual groups, and with political revolution substituted for the long march through the institutions. This point of view emphasizes the Marxist aspect of wokeism, but wokeism is not Marxist. I would call it rather post-Marxist. It's a very lobotomized Marxism, where the proletariat is basically abandoned, and the woke are totally obsessed with ethnic and sexual and religious identity groups. It's not Marxism, but they sometimes use the language of Marxism, and there are certain aspects of wokeism which are inherited from Marxism. Wokeism is a binary narrative which categorizes everyone as either victims or oppressors. That's certainly true. And that's sort of a copy from a bad copy from Marxism. It's like proletariat and the bourgeoisie, minorities are the proletariat and bourgeoisie is everybody else. Wokeism is fundamentally hostile to Enlightenment values, reason, science, liberty, and toleration. Now, so what are the principal ingredients of wokeism? Well, critical race theory is a major aspect. Where does it come from? It's a combination of critical theory, which is from the Frankfurt School. This is where the Marxism or post-Marxism comes into play, but it's Marxism, as I indicated in the previous slide, stripped of its economic core. And that is referred to as critical theory, and then imported into the United States and combined with the American anti-racist movement, we have critical race theory. Now, critical race theory is unfortunately an unfounded Manichaean and paranoid ideology, as I will explain. It's imported from the USA, where it is already dubious, and which it applies even less well to the situation in other countries such as Canada or Great Britain or other European countries. CRT foments anti-Semitism as it classifies Jews as white. And according to CRT, anti-Black racism is omnipresent and eternal. It cannot not exist regardless of the situation. So critical race theory is not falsifiable. Anti-white racism is impossible, according to CRT, while racism among non-whites is also impossible, according to CRT. In other words, CRT sees racism as always one way. Whites are racist against non-whites, and that's it. And if you classify Jews as whites, then anti-Semitism is not important. If you classify the Quebecois as whites, then that sort of evacuates the whole question of anti-Francophone prejudice within Canada, which is a major aspect of Canadian history, and it's important today because of how it is weaponized against secularism in Quebec. And finally, a good quote from Normand Baillargeon, who wrote the preface of the Santa Rosa book, and he was also one of the editors of the collective work I dealt with earlier. According to CRT, we live in a world divided into good people and bad, dominated and dominant, the individual being totally defined by his or her belonging to one of these two camps. So it's a very simplistic view. You're either with the good people or with the enemy. It's very simplistic. There's also an aspect of CRT which is referred to as standpoint epistemology, which is the hypothesis that only members of an identity group can have a good knowledge of that group. So, for example, that means that whites are incapable of understanding racism because, according to CRT, racism against whites is impossible. Therefore, whites cannot experience racism. Therefore, they cannot understand racism. This is the opposite of the isagoria I referred to in a previous slide. Isagoria being the concept that everybody has a right to a point of view, that the quality of an opinion does not depend on the identity of the person expressing it, whereas the woke mentality is it does. It depends entirely. A person's opinion can be dismissed entirely if they're white or male or whatever. The American anti-racist movement, under the influence of CRT, foments racism more than it reduces it, in my opinion. That's why I call it neo-racist. To distinguish, I just call it neo-racist to distinguish it from classical racism. Neo-racism is Eurocentric, just like classical European racism. For classical racists, Europe is the wellspring of civilization, the center of all that is good. And for neo-racists, Europe is the source of all evil. It's just the flip side of the same arrogance, the flip side of the same conceit. Now, of course, racism exists. Of course, we mustn't forget that the absurdity of CRT does not imply that racism is not a real problem. It's just that CRT is a really lousy way of dealing with it. Another aspect of CRT is the allegation of systemic racism or institutional racism or state racism. This means racism which is implicit in a system, which is not personal. Unfortunately, this concept is very vague. It has to be rejected unless the person using it specifies what they mean, what system is infected with racism, and which races are involved. It's racism against which race and in what system. Otherwise, it's just a general sort of generic slur, a generic accusation used to denigrate people that they want to denigrate. It's a concept also based on the assumption that any disparity between racial groups is caused by racism. This is extremely simplistic and false as well. Two racial groups or ethnic groups can have different different mean income levels, for example. That may be the result of racism, but it may be a result of other factors, education levels, country of origin, so on and so forth. Racism is only one of several possible explanations. Also, there seems to be a contradiction between this concept of systemic racism and the constant guilting of whites, that whites are always racist. Systemic racism is supposed to be not personal; it's in a system, and yet whites are always personally guilty. So I don't. This doesn't make sense to me. Systemic racism, as I say, it can exist if you specify exactly what you're talking about. For example, McWhorter in his book gives an example of an attitude which still exists among blacks, that academic success is a white thing. It's a white pursuit. And this was caused by racism in the past. Half a century ago, when schools were desegregated, and there was an influx of many blacks into schools that had been previously white exclusively. That caused a lot of problems. There was a lot of racism among the whites. The blacks did not feel welcome at all, and that unease has persisted in the form of this attitude among blacks, that the success in school is a white thing. But it was caused by racism in the past, but much of that racism has disappeared. Not all of it, but much of it. And so to solve the problem, anti-racism is not the solution. Other things need to be done. And he gives several ideas, such as ending the war on drugs, so that getting into the drug culture is not an attraction in terms of money. Improving the teaching of reading, so that it helps people, students who don't come from families where reading is already practiced, by their parents and family members, and also valorizing, appreciating non-academic disciplines, good old-fashioned, things such as plumbing and construction work and other skills which our society needs, and which should be appreciated at their value. And an example of systemic racism in Canada, I would say the Indian Act is probably an example of systemic racism. The system is that law, and the racism is against First Nations people. Intersectionality is another ingredient of the woke mixture. Principal author Kimberly Crenshaw. It deals with the combined effect of several forms of injustice, such as Black women who experience both racism and sexism. It started off as a reasonable idea, but it's been interpreted in ways compatible with CRT, and it tends to view every group monolithically. And so it comes down to a simplistic point system, where you get a point for each stigmatized group to which you can claim membership. It tends also to racialize or essentialize religious affiliation to the detriment of freedom of conscience, and that the consequence of that is opposition to secularism. If religious affiliation is something that's innate in the person and it can't be changed, then they do not have freedom of conscience. Also, intersectional feminists tend to grant greater priority to the anti-racist aspect, or transphobia, or whatever, and to overlook women's rights. And they tend to denigrate white women and And so they do not give enough importance to issues that affect all women, including whites, such as abortion rights. Excuse me. Intersectionality is anti-universalist. And Jean-François Stein, the author I dealt with in a previous slide, he sums it up well. Critical race theory and intersectionality prevent us from thinking of ourselves as autonomous individuals with complex and sometimes contradictory identities. Gender theory is an ideology whose principal author is Judith Butler, according to which sex is a social construct. It is not binary, but on a continuum. This is obviously false. Sex is binary. This dogma is incompatible with evolution. Evolution among species that have sex would be impossible if sex were not binary. According to gender theory, there exists within each individual a gender identity more authentic than the sex which is supposed to be assigned at birth. Of course, that's nonsense because the sex is not assigned; it's observed, except in a few very rare cases of error. There are harmful consequences to this dogma. Self-identification. If sex is a social construct, then you can just change sex by declaring yourself the other one. And this is an open door to abuse, such as heterosexual male predators in spaces reserved for women or mediocre male athletes in women's sports competitions. It also leads to irreversible medical procedures, both medication and surgery, when they are done on minor persons. And this is a very serious problem because, a person is a teenager is not sufficiently mature to make a decision about such radical medical interventions. And furthermore, it has been observed that if teenagers with gender dysphoria are simply allowed to grow up without intervening physically, the gender dysphoria usually resolves itself in a few years, and the person grows up to be a gay man or a lesbian in the majority of cases, not all, the majority. So by doing these procedures, you're doing a form of conversion, anti-gay conversion therapy, in fact. Now, the term transphobia, despite its overuse, is legitimate nevertheless because gender dysphoria exists and those who are affected must be protected against discrimination. However, the number of such persons is currently greatly exaggerated because of social contagion and the promotion of gender ideology in schools and institutions. And there's also something I would call religious transphobia. Religious people will oppose the trans phenomenon because, well, God gave you your body just the way it is. You must accept it as such. Well, no, I think that we must respect the self-determination of adults. As soon as the person is major and they clearly are well informed and want to transition, I see no reason why they should not be allowed to. Here are some examples of what's called Islamoleftism, which I mentioned earlier. The term was coined by the French author Pierre-André Taguieff, who is the author of a book, Why Deconstruct? Philosophical Origins and Political Avatars of French Theory. By French theory, he means the French postmodernist philosophers. Islamoleftism is a degenerate form of left-wing politics in which the priority which the left traditionally accorded to questions of class is now replaced by the defense of minorities, especially Muslims, as if Muslims constituted the new working class, as in Marxist ideology, or the new chosen people, as in Abrahamic mythology. So this I mentioned a little earlier in connection with the opinion of the ex-Muslims of Ireland. The concern for Muslims tends to be strongly biased towards the most visible, pious, and fundamentalist, because they are those who identify the most strongly, while ignoring secular Muslims and sometimes denigrating ex-Muslims. And here is a quotation from a document written by a British Trotskyist, Chris Harman, where he expresses qualified support by Marxists for political Islam. He writes, on some issues, we will find ourselves on the same side as the Islamists against imperialism and the state. Where the Islamists are in opposition, our rule should be with the Islamists sometimes, with the state never. I find this very dangerous. If you've got Islamism threatening a state, this means the Marxists, if they follow this mentality, will support the Islamists, who, in my opinion, are the extreme right. I find that very foolish. Here are some examples of Muslims, or maybe they should be called Islamists. Depends on where you draw the line between Islam and Islamism. When they adopt a woke mentality, woke mask. For example, AJ+, an affiliate of Al Jazeera, adopts a woke vocabulary when it's dealing with the lesbian, gays, and others. On the AJ+ Facebook page, they explain in a video, the LGBTQQ, et cetera, acronym. Example, a lesbian is a person who identifies as a woman, attracted by persons who identify as women. Well, I'm sorry, that's not the definition I would use. In my opinion, a lesbian is a woman who's attracted by women. It's not people who identify as women. This is very gender ideology, very, very woke. The Muslim Association of Canada received government funding to prepare a video course entitled Dismantling Islamophobia. And if you listen to some of those videos, they use very woke language. For example, they say that insulting the Prophet Muhammad is a microaggression against Muslims. And they use many other terms, which are obviously woke terms like systemic Islamophobia. And of course, they conflate race with religion constantly because it's in their interest to do so, because it amounts to a denial of freedom of conscience. So the Islamists are exploiting wokeism to advance their project. Postmodernism is a philosophy which promotes cultural relativism and skepticism, or even rejection of modernist ideas of objectivity, rationalism, knowledge, etc. In its most radical form, most postmodernism implies the denial of the very existence of objective reality and objective truth, and categorically rejects Enlightenment principles. It takes cultural relativism to an extreme, asserting that different cultures have different socially constructed realities. Now, according to Pluckrose and Lindsay, this postmodern philosophy is a major ingredient of wokeism, although considerably adapted by American activists. They call this applied postmodernism. But according to French author Brownstein, the postmodernists are less important in the woke mix. He points out that these philosophers were not activists, did not promote identity politics at all, and did not take themselves very seriously, while the woke take themselves far too seriously. Butler, on the other hand, directly references the French postmodern philosophers. So I think maybe Brownstein underestimates their importance in the woke mix. Another major aspect of the woke mix is identity politics, of course. Strong identity politics. It comes mostly from the American anti-racist movement. It involves a rejection of Enlightenment universalism, that is attaching greater importance to personal identities such as race or religion or sex or whatever, sexual orientation, etc., rather than to our commonalities as human beings. So, for example, Enlightenment universalism is considered too white for the woke. However, wokeism is itself Eurocentric, just like the they accuse universalism of being Eurocentric. The woke see, European culture as the root of all evil. So it's just the flip side of the same coin. They even accuse Enlightenment thinkers of inventing racism, but racism is pseudoscientific, and the solution to pseudoscience is better science, more enlightenment, more objectivity, more universalism. And here is an excellent quote from the well-known Franco-Lebanese author Amin Maalouf. He writes that, contrary to popular belief, the age-old fault of the European powers is not to have wanted to impose their values on the rest of the world, but very exactly the opposite, to have constantly given up respecting their own values in their relations with dominated peoples. As long as we have not removed this ambiguity, we run the risk of falling back into the same traps. The first of these values is universality, namely that humanity is one, diverse but one. Therefore, it is an unforgivable fault to compromise on fundamental principles under the eternal pretext that others would not be ready to adopt them. There are no human rights for Europe and other human rights for Africa, Asia, or the Muslim world. No people on earth is made for slavery, for tyranny, for arbitrariness, for ignorance, for obscurantism, nor for the enslavement of women. Each time one neglects this basic truth, one betrays humanity and one betrays oneself. There are several aspects of wokeism which resemble conspiracy theories. Trans persons claim to be targets of genocide. There are societies in which trans persons are certainly persecuted, and they were in the past here in Canada and the United States, but not today. As a matter of fact, trans rights are very well respected by almost all political parties. So there's no genocide. Another theory is that anti-Black racism is omnipresent. Sounds like a conspiracy theory to me. The idea that the Indigenous residential school system in Canada practiced literal physical genocide. Well, the evidence does not support that. The evidence is that it practiced cultural genocide, trying to assimilate them into European culture, not physical genocide. The level of persecution of minorities, those that the woke defend, is blithely exaggerated. Why? Well, to inflate their egos, I think. The greater the injustice one denounces, the greater one appears virtuous. Objectivity and nuance are not important to the woke. Now let's take a look at a few more examples of assertions of the woke. They claim that anti-Black racism is extreme, omnipresent, and inevitable. Anti-Black racism was extreme in the USA, but often less so elsewhere because of slavery and its legacy. but over the last half century, racism in the USA has been greatly reduced. The woke claim that whites are always racist, but never targets of racism. But racism is possible in any direction, of course, including between subgroups of a race. For example, anti-Quebecois racism among whites, or racism between different African tribes among blacks. Trans persons are persecuted and genocided? No, but not in Canada and the USA, where governments and institutions privilege trans persons but vilify critics of gender ideology. The woke say that Islamophobia is a form of racism. No, a religion is not a race. To criticize a religion is a right. To be wary of a religion is prudent and sometimes necessary. The woke claim that words are violence. No, verbal violence does exist, but it is less serious than physical violence. Furthermore, the mere use of controversial words does not even constitute verbal violence. Now, let's point out some of the religious aspects of Wokism. It is apparently inspired by the religious revival of Protestant Christian movements in the 18th and 19th centuries in the USA. Brownstein observes that placing the woke movement in the lineage of this revival movement, the first person to come up with this observation was the historian of Protestantism, Joseph Bottom. And he observes that it's very surprising to note the success that woke doctrines are having in contemporary American Protestant churches. For example, I found a video of Robin DiAngelo, the famous author of White Fragility, a video prepared by the United Methodist Church. Of course, it's extremely woke, and it's done in the name of Protestant Christianity. There's a lot of magical thinking in the woke mentality, gender identity. It's an immaterial concept comparable to the soul. And as the soul is more important than the body, gender identity is more important than the sex supposedly assigned at birth. Words are violence and have the power to wound, just like physical violence. To transform reality, one has only to change language. So to change sex, one only has to change one's name and pronouns. Original sin, whiteness, toxic masculinity, two original sins in the woke Parareligion. Rites and martyrs. Well, one of the rites of Wokism is to declare your pronouns. Land acknowledgements are very fashionable. That's where you state, oh, this meeting is taking place on the unceded traditional lands of such and such a native tribe. And sometimes it's true, sometimes it's not. But as Santa Rosa points out, no one, not even the wokest of the woke, has any intention of returning the Americas to the descendants of its first occupants. And I love what Bill Maher has to say about this this fashion. Either give the land back or shut the fuck up. Well said, Bill. There also have been public ceremonies of anti-racism where whites kneel or confess or request forgiveness from blacks or take certain oaths. Very, very religious-like rituals. DIE programs, diversity, inclusion, and equity, are rituals of Wokism. And martyrs, here are a couple of individuals who died while being arrested by police, and I'm not saying that the police action was justified, but they have been used as martyrs. And in the case of George Floyd, there are even neoracists who attempt to link the racism behind the death of George Floyd to Quebec Bill 21. They actually try to use the death of a black person in a foreign country as a way to denigrate secularism in Quebec. They have no shame. It makes no sense. Sacred texts, well, Ibrahim X. Kendi, How to Be an Anti-Racist. That's a very popular book among the woke. Kendi claims that if you're not anti-racist, then you are racist. And his definition of racism here is totally circular. Basically, he says that racism is racism and anti-racism is anti-racism. It tells us nothing about what these words mean. And he's supposed to be an expert on anti-racism. Robin DiAngelo, whom I mentioned a moment ago, she sells white guilt, and she makes a lot of money doing it. Self-flagellation among the white woke is very fashionable. Kimberly Crenshaw, to her credit, she herself has criticized the misuse of her concept of intersectionality. I'm on the face of it, it's a reasonable idea that, you know, several forms of oppression, when they're combined, can give results that don't occur with the individual forms. Judith Butler, author of Gender Trouble, here's a quote from her: "The univocity of sex, the internal coherence of gender, and the binary framework of both sex and gender are regulatory fictions." So she appears to be saying that both sex and gender are just social constructs. They're both fictions. By the way, recently she has also claimed that Hamas and Hezbollah are leftist groups. I beg to differ with her on that. And Horia Boutelja is a notorious French anti-Semite. Her book has been translated into English, Whites, Jews, and Us. The Los Angeles Review of Books loved it because it's very anti-secular. And her anti-secularism is very significant because she's from France, which is the ground zero of the most advanced form of secularism that we know on the planet. A couple of mantras, 3 mantras here. Diversity is our strength. This is a nonsense sentence repeated by Justin Trudeau all the time. Black Lives Matter. Well, of course, Black Lives Matter, but it's repeated as a mantra. And if you say something different, like all lives matter, then you'll be accused of being a racist. And trans women are women. Well, that's not quite true. Trans women are biologically men. Trans men are biologically women. We all know this. It doesn't mean that people with gender dysphoria should be mistreated. It doesn't mean that adults should not be allowed to determine what they do with their own body. But trans women are women is a false statement. Manichaeism. Woke tend to be very Manichaean. That is, you're either with them or against them. And if you disagree with them in any way, then you're far right or xenophobic or racist or whatever. I'm sure you've heard them sing these songs. The elect are the pure, especially blacks and their allies. As John McWhorter expresses it, the elect are members of a religion of a kind within which the dissenter is not just someone in disagreement, but is a kind of environmental pollution. This is a very strong statement. In other words, the woke, the elect, treat those who disagree with them like pollution, like garbage. And it's true. Anathema. This is a major aspect of woke mentality and a major aspect of many religions. An anathema is a curse or sentence cast upon heretics and apostates. Among Christians, this sentence is often called excommunication. Among the woke, it's called cancel culture, whereby heretics who fail to respect woke dogma, either intentionally or inadvertently, are severely punished. They're bullied or ostracized, or they lose their job. They suffer social death, loss of career, etc., whatever. Among the piously woke, cancel culture does not exist in their opinion, although it may exist on the political right, according to them, because they say anyone they cancel deserved it. That is, the cancellation was a legitimate punishment for unacceptable behavior. Certain special features of the woke parareligion, which make it different from other religions. There's no God. There's no forgiveness or redemption. The sinner must work tirelessly and forever against his or her sin in order to be an acceptable ally. There's no end point. It's an eternal struggle, apparently. The woke claim to be dissident, rebellious, but they're not. They're very conformist. There are lots of huge corporations that have got on the woke bandwagon. It's very mainstream. It's a Wokism originated in the universities. This gives it a false legitimacy, a falsely scientific aura. This phenomenon is sometimes called idea laundering. The fact that an idea comes through the university sort of launders that idea and makes it look legitimate, even though it is not. How do we stand up to wokeism? Well, we must learn to say no and decisively. Courage is required because, as Barry Weiss points out, we got here because of cowardice. So we just have to suck it up, and we must stop submitting to the emotional blackmail. Always remember that the continued existence of racism, sexism, homophobia, and other injustices in society does not justify the follies of the woke. They make things worse. Blasphemy is one weapon I can suggest. It's a way to show that the beliefs do not deserve respect. For example, all lives matter is very blasphemous. They hate it. I like the expression turf lives matter because turfs are those who are feminists who are critical of gender ideology. So this has two blasphemous, it's doubly blasphemous. Here's three more examples of anti-woke blasphemy. No, white supremacy is not the root of all evil. The quality of an opinion is not a function of the identities of the person expressing it. And sexual orientation is based on biological sex, not gender. In other words, the definition of lesbianism we saw earlier, it's not someone who identifies as a woman who's attracted to those who identify as women. It's women attracted to women. It's based on sex. If wokeism is a religion or a para-religion, then we must respond with secularism. We must demand separation between wokeism and state. Now, here's an example you've probably heard of, the Richard Bilkstow case, where the need for separation is very clear. It's an extreme example. Richard Bilkstow was accused of white supremacism by the moderator of a DIE session in Toronto. He worked for the Toronto School Board. And then he was further defamed and ostracized, and he eventually committed suicide. It's an example of the toxicity of critical race theory and the DIA programs, which claim to be anti-racist, but on the contrary, foment racism. It is an extreme case, of course. Not all DIE sessions end in suicide, and surely not all DIE moderators are as fanatical as Kike Ojo Thompson, who was the moderator of this session. But such para-religious programs are nevertheless unacceptable in the civil service and in public school boards. We must demand separation between CRT, DIE, and the state. And some questions. How did the woke mentality become so dominant in several countries in so little time? I think we need to think about that. Secularism involves fighting against the purple economy. This is an expression from an Australian colleague, Max Wallace. The purple economy being the money that churches make by having fiscal privileges, by not paying taxes, etc. So wokeism has to be studied from the fiscal point of view, I suggest, from the point of view of the purple economy. Who finances it and to what extent? What amounts of money are spent by our governments on programs such as DIE, anti-racism measures, grants to Islamists, etc.? And my conclusion, wokeism is based on extreme destructive criticism of European civilization. It fails to recognize any merits of European civilization. It fails to recognize anything wrong with non-European civilizations. It fails to appreciate the nuances of history. It has no vision for the future, only eternal struggle. It rejects the universalism and objectivity of the Enlightenment. And one final example I'd like to mention, once again, the issue of indigenous residential schools in Canada. There were allegations of mass graves, but so far no bodies have been found. These were allegations based on ground penetrating radar. But after 2 or 3 years, no bodies have been found, other than bodies from cemeteries that were already known to be there. It's just that the stones were lost or had degenerated or whatever. And so there are so-called anti-racists who are determined to call this genocide. Well, in fact, there is no evidence of that. And the authors of this article say the influence of the Aboriginal industry, they allege some corruption in the allocation of funds in creating the unmarked graves hysteria has been reinforced by a reactionary position that is sweeping our institutions in Canada and the United States, a stance pejoratively referred to as wokeism. In wokeism, identity politics becomes totalitarian. All beliefs of oppressed identities must be affirmed. And so you can't say that a Native person is wrong on this issue because they're never wrong. Because if anybody's wrong, it's got to be a white person. So that is the totalitarian aspect of wokeism. Thank you for your attention.